Welcome to Ryan's Running Reviews in partnership with Roadrunner Sports, and today we are taking a look at the New Balance 880 V13. We'll also compare it to the 1080 V12. Let's run with it. Now, before we get started, I do want to say these shoes were provided to me by Roadrunner Sports. However, no one had a chance to preview this video, and this file synopsis is my own. I'd also like to say, please leave a like on the video and consider subscribing. Here we go. The 880 V13 is a neutral workhorse daily trainer designed to handle a wide variety of runs. New Balance said they also designed this shoe for those that like to walk or are on their feet all day long. It's kind of like your conventional, reliable, neutral daily trainer. Now, if you're confused by the New Balance numbering system, you're not alone. This is the 880 V13, which is a neutral daily trainer. Then they also have the 860 V13, which is over here in the corner. Now, they look similar, and that's because they are slightly similar. The 860 is a stability running shoe. Basically, on the medial side, you have some posting, which keeps your foot from rolling to the inside, while the 880, the shoe we're taking a look at today, is a neutral daily trainer where it has a dual density midsole but no stability mechanisms. Although I will say this is a relatively stable neutral shoe, although not classified as a stability shoe. I realize that's confusing, but this is a neutral daily trainer, while the 860 is a stability trainer. So hope that makes sense. As far as stats go, this shoe does cost $140. It did gain a little bit of weight, now coming in at 10.6 ounces, which is about a 0.3 of an ounce increase compared to last year. We had the same stack height and drop with roughly 37 millimeters in the heel and 27 in the forefoot for, again, that same 10 millimeter drop. I'll also bring in the 1080 V12 so we can compare the two. They look very similar on paper. However, they do have very different experiences. Now, the 1080 V12 is New Balance's premium flagship neutral daily trainer, and they look similar on paper. However, I do think they feel completely different. The 1080 costs $160, while the 880 is $140. The 1080, while it does have a roughly similar stack height, does have an 8 millimeter drop, while the 880 has a 10 millimeter drop. And I think the 1080 weighs about 0.3 of an ounce lighter, coming in at 10.3 ounces, while the 880 comes in at 10.6. So we'll go through a little bit more in depth as we go into the review, but I wanted to bring in the two as far as the stats go to compare them because they're both neutral daily trainers. And if you're in the market for one, you'll probably take a look at the other. So I think it's helpful to take a look and kind of see what the difference is. As far as the upper goes, this is where all the changes took place. The midsole is the same. The 880 V13 is just an upper update. They changed it from a jacquard mesh to an engineered mesh. It feels very traditional. Breathability is average, feels about middle of the road, pun intended. I will say the sizing feels about a half size small, and it's a rather narrow experience. So I would go up about half a size to get a little bit more wiggle room. I found my pinky had some rubbing and my toe was pretty much near the top of the toe box. So I feel like it does run about a half size small. I will also say that the 880 V13 does come in almost every width and size, so you can get everything from narrow to extra wide depending on your foot shape. I realize that gets a little bit tricky depending on the colorways in the store. Not every store carries all the widths and everything, but I will say in my experience, the standard shoe in my size does run a little bit narrow and about a half size small. So I keep that in mind. I think last year was a little bit too wide. I read some of the reviews just because I didn't have last year's version. They were saying it was too wide, so I think they may have overcorrected here. And this is definitely a little bit narrow. Had some rubbing on the outside of my pinky and about a half size small. So just keep that in mind. The tongue here feels very much like a New Balance tongue. It feels almost identical to the 860 and the More V4 and pretty comparable to the 1080 V12. Feels like they use the same blueprint. It's moderately padded, does a good job keeping the lace pressure off, and I was quite happy with it. It is non-gusseted, so that's just another small side note. The heel counter, relatively strict, does a good job keeping your heel in place. I had no heel slip, and I think the lockdown was superb. Now, part of the reason why the lockdown was so superb is because it is a rather narrow experience, and I think it is a more snug fit. So lockdown is great. It's just going to hug your foot a little bit tighter than some people may like. Now, if we compare it to the 1080 V12, the 1080 V12 has a bit more room through the forefoot and midfoot, mainly because it just feels like a little bit longer of a shoe and has that hypo knit material, which is stretchier. It is less breathable compared to the 880, and I will say the 880 does have a bit of a better lockdown. I thought the 1080 V12 lockdown was good, just not as good compared to the 880. So just keep that in mind. The tongue, very comparable. The only major difference is it is partially gusseted and kind of connects into that hypo knit upper, so you can pull it and kind of stretch it a little bit more compared to the 880's tongue. Moving on to the midsole, this is what really separates these two models. The 880 V13 has the same midsole as last year. It's a dual density setup. We have Fresh Foam X in the heel and then through the midfoot. And then once you get to the forefoot, it transitions into partially Fresh Foam X and partially fuel cell. So the white foam in the forefoot area is fuel cell foam. Now, this is confusing because I think New Balance has a wide variety of fuel cell foam, so they don't necessarily label it. So this fuel cell foam is a more dense material. They don't necessarily label this on the website. They don't advertise it, but when you ask them, hey, what is this white foam in the forefoot, they say, yes, it's fuel cell. Now, it's a different kind of fuel cell than we see with like the SC Elite, which is like their top tier racing shoe. This kind of fuel cell is much lighter and bouncier, while the fuel cell we see here on the 880 V13 is a more dense kind of fuel cell. I think it's more like an EVA foam base. So just an interesting side note, if you will. On the other hand, or other foot, I should say, is the 1080 V12, which just has Fresh Foam X from heel to toe. It's a very consistent midsole. In my experience when using these two different shoes, I actually prefer the 880, and that's for a couple reasons. Yes, they have similar stack heights. However, I think the 880 has a bit more volume towards the back part of the shoe. I felt like the heel section was a little bit more lively, had a little bit more squish and energy return to it compared to the 1080. The forefoot experience was also quite different. In the 880, it felt very dense. It felt like it had a nice level of shock absorption and impact protection. Not the liveliest or bounciest I've ever felt. I think New Balance branded this as, fuel cells are bouncy, lively foam. They said you have a very energetic toe-off ride, and I didn't think that was the case. It felt very dense and, yes, gave a nice level of shock absorption, just wasn't the most energetic. The 1080, on the other hand, I think is more focused on like a nice, soft, plush experience. I didn't find the Fresh Foam to be the most energetic, but it does have a much softer, much more plush feeling in the forefoot. So in my opinion, it really comes down to your personal preference. The 1080 has a very consistent, soft, Fresh Foam X ride, while the 880 has a very soft and slightly bouncy heel section, and then kind of transition to a slightly firmer, slightly denser feeling forefoot. I will also say that both shoes are relatively stable. You have a really wide base. The 1080 has a slightly wider forefoot compared to the 880. But if you're someone who doesn't want to go all the way to a stability shoe or like all the way to the 860, I think both of these are quite stable and work quite well. Moving on to the outsole, both shoes have a ridiculous amount of rubber. The 880 does have a bit more rubber thickness. It has 5 millimeters of outsole rubber, which is pretty substantial. Trail shoes have 4 millimeter lugs. So for a daily trainer to have 5 millimeters outsole rubber is quite significant. Now, these shoes will last you a little bit longer compared to most other conventional daily trainers, but they do tend to weigh a little bit more just because you have so much rubber here. So just keep that in mind when taking a look at all the different options out there. But yeah, just tons of rubber here, and it seems pretty consistent with the New Balance theme. I'll do a quick synopsis here of the differences between the two shoes. They're both workhorse neutral daily trainers. The 1080 costs $160. The 880 costs $140. The 880 has a 10 millimeter drop with a comparable heel stack height, while the 1080 has an 8 millimeter drop, giving you a bit more foam under the forefoot. They are both slightly heavier options, coming in at 10.6 ounces and 10.3. They both have a ridiculous amount of rubber on the outsole, while the 880 has a slightly thicker outsole pattern. Now, as far as the midsole goes, this is what really separates the shoes. I'll say the 880 has a slightly softer and bouncier heel section, even though it has a comparable heel stack height. Feels like there's a bit more volume here and just feels a little bit more lively compared to the 1080. The forefoot is also quite different. You have that dual density setup with Fresh Foam X and Fuel Cell. It's a rather dense foam. It's a bit firmer, but I think does a good job of giving you a nice level of shock absorption. It's not the most energetic sensation ever, but I think it works quite well, and I didn't feel like I was able to bottom out the forefoot foam at all. The 1080, on the other hand, has a very consistent feel with that Fresh Foam X. I think it's more focused on providing a nice, soft, luxurious ride rather than energy return. And I will say the forefoot feeling here is a bit softer compared to the 880. So at the end of the day, it comes down to your personal preference and what you're looking for. But I hope this helps you guys delineate between these two models, as they are kind of similar on paper. And again, I like the 880 just because it has a bit more squish and bounce in the heel, has a slightly superior lockdown. And that's part of the reason why I think this shoe is a little bit more snug. And I do prefer the slightly firmer, slightly more dense feeling in the forefoot. But I would love to hear from you guys. What do you think of these two models, and which one are you going to go for? I'm Ryan from Ryan's Running Reviews, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. Thanks.